Ja, ich muss noch schnell. Okay. Better. Schönen guten Abend. Ich werde gleich auf Englisch weiterfahren, weil der heutige Vortrag, oder ich muss sagen, die heutigen Vorträge, denn es ist eine Koproduktion, werden in englischer Sprache durchgeführt, weil die zweite Referentin kein Deutsch kann. Ja, also muss also auf Englisch stattfinden. Auf Spanisch wäre kein Problem, aber das wiederum würde für Sie ein Problem darstellen. Es freut mich außerordentlich und I'm very happy to present you Dr. Rosario Figari Layuz. She is Argentinian. She holds a position as a scientific collaborator at the University of Gießen. As such, she works in the German-Colombian Peace Institute. It's called CAPAS. And before, she had a researcher position in social sciences at the University of Constance with a project sponsored by the European Research Council. She earned her PhD in political science at the University of Marburg, and her thesis research focused on the role of national criminal trials in Argentina. Now she has spread her investigations all over the world. It's not only, I should say like that, no, it's not only about Argentina, but also many other countries. And you might read her in her publications, basically published in English, and some of those you might find in internet and might download them. So her main topic is transitional justice, and I think something it has to do with what we are going to hear today. And on the other hand, we have Juliette Vargas Trujillo from Colombia. She holds a Bachelor of Law from Universidad Nacional de Colombia, and she has done a Master Legum from the University of Humboldt at Germany. She is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Göttingen and science collaborator at CAPAS and ZPAL. I hope that I didn't say anything wrong. If it were, then please correct. So now it's up to you, and we have a very interesting title, The Domino Effect of Ongoing Violence on Transitional Justice, the Case of Colombia's Special Jurisdiction for Peace.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me see if I can. Okay, have to check. How can I? I can't change it, but well. So first of all, just.
You want to add it to change slides?
Just to do like this when I want to change. Not now, but how do I do it?
use them on the page.
Yeah.
The
That one. So
elements. Yeah.
back and forwards.
Mhm.
So, well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to have the chance to present our research findings here to Professor Thomas Fischer, to Professor May Brandon, I'm sorry. And well, actually, it's one of the first times that we are presenting these research findings because the publication was 2 months ago. This is actually one part of a bigger project that we did in cooperation with several institutions. As you can see, this is part of the call for cooperative projects of the Institute Capaz, trying to promote research between Colombian universities and German universities. And as a result of that, we applied for this project on the topic of the impact of ongoing violence on transitional justice. So we are going to just to show some of the research of this aspect of the project, but it was a bit wider. Perhaps we're going to say something about that. Let me see if I can change. So the project, the general, that was the name of the project. What we wanted to see when we started, it was what is the impact actually and the complexities that transitional justice measures or mechanisms have to face when they are implemented in context of ongoing violence. But also the other aspect that was relevant for us is, okay, what kind of protective or security measures are being implemented in order to deal with that violence. And as you can see, we were a team of 6 researchers, students also from the University of Antioquia, me from the University of Gießen, Juliette from from Göttingen. The funding of the project was from the Institute Capaz and also a part of the University of Antioquia. So I think it was a really very interesting project, working all together. And I have to admit, we didn't know each other before the project started. So it was a challenge, right? So as explained, well, we have this, and now I am going directly to this article that we wrote and on the impact of transitional justice, right? And what we wanted to see is what happened in this context. Because perhaps as you already probably saw in other sessions, transitional justice is usually those measures or mechanisms which are in charge to deal with the legacy of past violence, right? So how can we provide reparation, justice, the access to the truth when violence finished, right? However, we can see that there has been a change, actually, an evolution in transitional justice, where this paradigm is starting to be implemented in context where there was no transition at all, or the transition is very near, or it's transitioning at that moment. But of course, that makes that the characteristics and the impact that transitional justice acquire are very different. And also how this affects the goals of transitional justice. Can we expect the same goals that if we implemented in a context like when the transition was 10 years ago? Well, that was our question, actually. And for this, we decided to focus on the HEP, that is the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia. That is a special tribunal in order to deal with the crimes of the guerrilla group, the FARC, and also with the crimes of security forces. Well, how do we do it? I thought it was important to explain also the methodology because it was also, in many aspects, new for us, right? And also a challenge aspect. Well, we, at the end of the day, it wasn't the idea when we started. We finished in doing an hybrid qualitative methodology. The project started in the middle of 2020, right? So the pandemic was there. And there was so much uncertainty. We didn't know what was possible, what not. And our first idea was to do this case study approach in the case of Urabá, that's in the department of Antioquia in Colombia. But the problem was that first, it wasn't possible to go to the field to conduct the interviews, right? Because of the pandemic, but also because of the security situation, depending the moment. And I want to say that also the pandemic was a factor that contributed to increased violence. and to increase the restrictions to access to resources, to communication, to transport, putting the population in those areas in a more situation of vulnerability, right? So it was even worse at that time. So when we started conducting a survey and a revision of the bibliography on the topic, reports of NGOs, also the judgments of the HEP regarding security measures and governmental reports and newspapers. And then we wanted to start with the interviews, and we say, okay, how do we do it? And we say, well, we can't go to the field, we have to start online. And I didn't have this experience before, and I was a bit skeptical, but well, we thought, okay, we start with the interviews to the functionaries, right, to institutions, to organizations, but not to directly victims and perpetrators, because we wanted to do it face-to-face, and we were waiting, you know. And well, at the end, that was a good experience. The results were better than we thought. And we could actually also, at the end, in March or in April, go actually to Uraba to do the interviews. And it was a huge difference, and it was very interesting, the contrast. And we conducted interviews with judges of the HEP, with functionaries, with prosecutors, with people working on security, with victims participating in the HEP, but also ex-combatants, representative of ex-combatants or lawyers participating, and also NGOs. If I am forgetting somebody, Juliette is going to complete me. We did it like a questionnaire, so also trying the independent blogs, depending who was the interview. And what we wanted to know actually were, first, how was the perception of violence in that area after the peace agreement? So people were noticing a difference, how they were experiencing violence. Then we wanted to see how did they actually assess the role of the HEP, and if the fact of being participating there was also increasing the exposure to violence, right? And finally, also what other kinds of effects did they noted in the HEP, in the participation? And well, that's not exactly what we're going to describe, but also an analysis of the protection measures. So were they effective? What was the whereabout? Were they fast enough? Well, so there were like several goals that we wanted to know. And in doing so, because that's one of the things, and I think that was one of the like paradoxical aspects in this context, right? On the one side, it's like everyone knows that violence is affecting transitional justice. But on the other side, it's like so normalized that nobody thinks that it is a topic, right? So when we started to review, so what do we see in the transitional justice scholarship? We saw that there was really a research gap because, well, first, transitional justice, as I probably already know, many of you, and you also analyzed in the past sessions, deals with this violence of the past. But what is the link of transitional justice with present violence? So how it deals with it, right? And what we saw in the scholarship is like four main trends, let's say, or foci that we can identify. One of them is that many studies, especially in the thousands, focus on the idea of, okay, when is the right time to implement transitional justice after a transition? It's better to implement transitional justice, to implement 4 years after the transition, 20 years after the transition. Perhaps many people know this concept of post-transitional justice, referring to transitional justice implemented like 20 years after the transition. The other question also that there are several scopes or several works is the sequencing, right? So what is better to implement? First, a through commission, then trials, then reparation measures. So what could have a better impact and increase the scope of transitional justice? A second trend that we identify actually is this idea of violent peace. So a bit breaking or deconstructing the idea that after a transition, there's no violence anymore, right? So that we have to deal with post-conflict violence, post-accord violence, and actually that is a very common characteristic in many societies. In many transitional society, actually there are several studies also on South Africa, which is also presented as a paradigm. And the idea of presenting that post-transitional context as not violence is also an idealization of the context in many. Of course, it changed in the degree, right? That it can be how intense is this violence and what kind of form of violence. For example, in many studies appear that there's an increase in gender-based violence, in gangs violence, sometimes armed also violence, depending where. A third trend focus on the causes, right? Why? What are the factors underlying this continuity of violence in transitional justice context, right? Because transitional justice had a narrow approach, just leading with the violation of civil and political rights? Is because they didn't deal with specific perpetrators? So that is the other issue, right? And linked to that, and the fourth and one of the newest approaches of transitional justice is the transformative justice approach. So what is the role of transitional justice to deal with this new violence or persistent violence? But how can transitional justice contribute to address that and to reduce it? But as you can see, there was almost no studies saying how violence impacts on transitional justice. So, and that was what we thought. It's a bit striking that there's not much about that. It's so obvious, right? But on the other side, there was no study. So now going to our first case study of Colombia, and what was very briefly, because I don't know if many of you perhaps know what happened there, but with the peace agreement of 2016 between the guerrilla of the FARC and the government of Santos, well, there was a ceasefire and also, sorry, wait, no, I can't, yeah. And well, part of this agreement included this transitional justice program and the creation of special institutions in order to provide truth to victims, to provide redress, and to obtain some kind of accountability, but accountability with a restorative and retributive perspective combined. So what we see also is that there was these three institutions, well, the through commission that I think you were already talking about through commissions, the special jurisdiction for peace in order to also obtain some accountability for the crimes committed by the FARC and also by the security forces, while providing some through to the victim and some also restorative kinds of reparations that Juliet is going to explain, and also a unit for the search of disappeared persons. And nowadays, the only ones that are still current is the HEP, the special jurisdiction, and the unit. The commission has already delivered the final report. Okay, now I will give Juliet the word, and please, so on the Colombian context and the situation of violence there. Oh, wait a second.
Okay.
Okay.
But I have to, yeah. You have to tell me when I have to change the.
No, right now it's perfect. Do you hear me?
We hear you, but we can't see you. One moment.
Oh.
Yeah.
But you can see the presentation, so.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very honored to be virtually with you and to meet you virtually. Right now in Bogota, Colombia. It's a very sunny day. So coming back to our presentation, and thank you, Rosario, for this important introduction of the project and the context. We also analyzed how to explain this current context of violence, of continuation and reconfiguration. We don't want to oversimplify the analysis, but basically we and other experts and scholars identify some factors. First of all, as already mentioned by Rosario, the peace agreement has a bipartisan nature. It means it's a partial peace only with the FARC, EP guerrilla group, which was at the moment the largest and the oldest and the strongest guerrilla group. But other illegal groups remain active. For example, the ELN guerrilla group, the National Liberation Army, and the AGC. We will talk about this group later in detail. And it means the conflict remain at least with these groups, for example. And it's partial peace also because, although the huge majority of guerrilla members demobilized, there is a group of combatants that don't take part in the peace negotiations, and after the signing of the peace accord, some dissidents left the peace process. So they reconfigurate other illegal groups, the FARC dissidents, that maybe you already have heard. Secondly, the FARC-EP, of course, exerted a social and territorial control in many regions, and then as soon as they leave these territories, there is a power vacuum, and this absence was not properly filled by the state, the Colombian state. So there is these disputes over territory, over social and territorial control between illegal groups and other new groups, talking about this reconfiguration of the conflict. Actually, many experts talk about many different conflicts in Colombia, not one single conflict. And it's important to note here also that presence of state is not only in military terms. That's why the problem of not having proper infrastructure, for example, hospitals, schools, etc., is very linked to the problem of the high levels of social inequality. Although the peace agreement, to some extent, tackle these structural factors of violence through the rural reform, for example, through some policies on illegal crops, political participation. But here again, the problem has been the poor implementation of these important, crucial measures. Maybe the majority of you already know that soon after the signing of the peace agreement, the next government, the government of President Duque, was openly against the peace process and the peace accord. So they continue the implementation, but at a very slow pace. And in some cases, they oppose to some points. So this slow pace or very poor implementation had, of course, an impact to tackle and it continues having an impact to tackle this social inequality. Yes, thanks, Rosario. Can we advance to the next, please? Yes, just a very, very brief overview of the situation. I don't want to read. You can read the slide, but just to say that it's not only the perception that many communities have on violence, but the numbers of the violence in some cases is even more than before the peace agreement. It's very paradoxical, so to say. And at the same time, there is not much advancement in these criminal investigations on identifying who are the perpetrators, not only direct perpetrators, but also intellectual perpetrators, for example. And I just want to note that from these ex-combatants that has been targeted or attacked, at least according to the former president of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, at least 80% are participating somehow in the HEP proceedings. So, of course, the impact is very direct. And also important to have in mind that, the the profile of the majority of this targeted social leaders or ex-combatants is that they are really committed or participating in this peace process and in the implementation. So although there has been and there are still some discussions on how on the nature of this violence, if it's political, it's only ordinary crime, if it is systematic or not. Actually, the reality is somehow, or not somehow, directly connect to the peace process and the commitment, the participation, the involvement, the engagement with the peace process. Yes. So next slide, please. Yes. So as Rosario already mentioned, we focus our empirical work in the Urabá region, which correlates with the case 04 of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. That's traditionally a banana-producing region, although with the paramilitary intervention and violence, it became then like a palm oil region. It's a region of a great biodiversity and great resources. And it's an exit to the Caribbean Sea. It's very geostrategic, so to say. And this geostrategic character or nature is related to the trade route for drugs and other resources, illegal or legal. As I already mentioned, there is a long history of violent paramilitary presence there and of land dispossession to benefit the majority of cases. Third one as entrepreneurs and economic actors in this region. In this region is very striking that, and not only in this region, in Colombia, it's very striking that in most cases, the violence is accentuated where there are vulnerable communities because they are poor, there is no infrastructure, there is no economic development, etc. And currently, the two main illegal actors disputing the control of territories are the ELN guerrilla group, National Liberation Army, and the Self-Defense Gaitanistas de Colombia, AGC. The majority of territory is right now under the control of this AGC, but these disputes continue, and of course, civilians are in the middle of these disputes. Yeah. Can we go, please, to the next slide? Yeah. Okay. Going to the HEP participatory approach, and as Rosario already mentioned, it's this HEP, this special jurisdiction for peace, is very unique, very sui generis judicial mechanism because it foresees a criminal procedure to establish criminal responsibility, but it entails restorative elements and aims, and actually it privileges a restorative pathway through this so-called dialogic procedure. I don't know if you have heard anything about this, but it's something innovative, proposing the co-construction of truth, including both the narratives of victims and perpetrators through oral or written reports. And it entails as well the possibility of direct encounters. I don't know if you see in the pictures, at the left side, you can see some victims. At the center, you can see the head judges, and then at the right, perpetrators. This is a picture of one of the first hearings or encounters, and this is called the hearing of acknowledgement of truth and responsibility, which is as a sort of milestone of this dialogic procedure. So after a gradual process of co-construction of truth, the idea is that perpetrators acknowledge their responsibility after revealing important information about the motivation of the crimes, modus operandi, other perpetrators, very important in terms of this construction of truth, and other crimes that maybe they committed. And the idea is that they provide much more information that was already established in the ordinary criminal jurisdiction. Therefore, participation is a cornerstone also of this restorative approach, and it implies the possibility of direct participation, not only through legal representatives or attorneys, and also because if this restorative pathway is successful, it leads to the imposition of restorative sanctions and measures instead of the common sanctions, which are imprisonment. So that's why it's very unique. It's a sort of experiment, so to say, very controversial, of course. But as far as we observe, it is very important the possibility to have a meaningful and effective participation. And connecting with that, I want to go to the next slide, please. Sorry that you have to. Yeah, and that's why we also analyze the meaning of participation. I mean, it is crucial for any transitional context, but in the case of the special jurisdiction, the Colombian special jurisdiction for peace is like really a cornerstone, is key to achieve goals in terms of truth, accountability, redress, etc. I mean, from the analysis that we conduct in this regard, we observe that participation can enable victims to regain a sense of agency and control that was lost due to the crime and the harm they experimented. It is also important in terms of empowerment and inclusion, as Laplante points out, especially because it's a possibility to give voice to voices that were before marginalized or discriminated. It's also important that participation is way beyond mere presence. And of course, in a criminal process, it's very tricky to understand to what extent participants, like victims or perpetrators, have are decision makers. Of course, the judges have the last word, but they can provide important inputs to understand the factual, the context, to provide cultural, to understand, the cultural environment. They can provide, of course, important information, especially, the victims, on what are the restorative and the reparations that they should receive. Participants also can provide important information on, and participants, I refer to victims and perpetrators, on the responsibility of other perpetrators, as I already mentioned. And finally, from the point of view of this restorative approach, it's expected that perpetrators not only reveal the truth about the crimes committed other perpetrators, but also achieve a sort of restorative accountability by acknowledging their responsibility. And that's crucial in this idea that through these encounters and this dialogic procedure, they can foster, if not reconciliation, because that's a very huge goal, at least they can ease the coexistence between communities, victimized communities, and perpetrators. Yes, please, the next one. Yeah, and conscious of the importance of participation, the special jurisdiction for peace foresees protective measures. They have a specialized group on protection for victims, witnesses, and other participants. The participants can request these measures, or judges or staff from the UIA, Unit of Indictment and Accusation. Is a sort of, this unit is similar to the prosecution, so to say. These protection measures can be individual, but in the majority of cases, they are collective, since the approach of participation at the HEP is mainly collective through through the taking advantage of the ethnic identity of many communities, etc. And they actually have a monitoring system of risk and prevention, and they want to foster this approach of the prevention, which is a mix between prevention and protection. At the moment, however, the protection approach of the HEP has proven insufficient because there are too many requests and low capacity, foremost because the generalized violent situation is a matter of structural measures, and of course they cannot be solved properly only with these protection measures, which are precautionary measures. So it has proven it is not so efficient, and also because there are many requests, they don't have actually the capacity to properly provide protection measures to all victims or perpetrators asking for these measures. Can we go please to the next slide? And I think
that, yeah, we go, because of the time, I go directly to the...
Yeah.
Oh, no. Okay, so now, so that you have seen, or you have a better idea also of the context, of the relevance of the participatory approach of the HEP, and also that actually there was some attempts, and there are very important to deal with this violence and to protect participants. The problem is still ongoing, and actually in many cases even increasing right now, the situation of violence. And what we realized is this idea that, the first aspect that was being affected by this violence was the participation. So it wasn't so effective and meaningful. Now we're going to show you how. And the problem is that affecting participation, as you saw, implies also affecting all the possibility, reparatory goals and aspects that this would actually bring with it, right? So all what Juliette was mentioning is not possible at a certain point, having also affected the other aspects that are only possible through participation, such as the access to truth, the access to justice, the access perhaps to reconstructing social bounds. So that's why we name it like the domino effect, because it's like a chain effect, right? Affecting or restricting participation is inevitable to affect all the other aspects. It's not possible to keep it like, well, we don't really have an effective and substantive participation, but we can have access to truth. So it's unfortunately not like that. So this is perhaps the 3 dimensions that we identified in this first project, right? There is not this possibility, and that's why we're going to describe now these 3 aspects: the restriction of participation, the limited access to truth and justice, and the undermining of possibility of reconciliation and restoration of social bounds, right? So first, okay, no. Regarding the limitation of participation, why and how, right? So what we can see in the current Colombian scenario is that participation is restricted or curtailed because of 2 dynamics. One is the context, the conflict-related violence, right? So just the fact to be living in an area where you are being under threat, where you are being under control by armed groups, where there are armed confrontations, of course, it's a limitation to participate, to attend hearings. For example, in cases of enforced displacement, people can't participate, they have to leave their homes, they have to leave, they can't go on in the process. In cases where they have forced confinement, they can't leave the communities. So it's not possible to participate in transitional justice instances, right? That is independent of the head of the transitional justice dynamic. But the second aspect is that also the fact of being involved in transitional justice processes, right, in this case, implies an increase of the exposure, of the visibility of those actors involved, and of course that with that there's an increase of the risk, right? Because it's the question what these persons could say in this tribunal, who could be involved through their words, through their participation, and the thing is that once they go to the HEP, they have to come back to the territory, right? And imagine how it's to live in contexts where you are around armed groups that perhaps they think they could be reported there, they could be denounced, their crimes, their interests, and to become more in the public eye. So what we see is like we could sum it up in three kind of restrictions. One is like really full cancellation of participation. So in many interviews, they told us that many people decided not to participate in the presentation of collective reports. They didn't want to have their names there because they didn't want to be visible. In other cases, they decided, or they couldn't. In many cases, it's not just the decision, right? It's like, it's not possible because it's a question of death or life. So they decided not to go to provide testimony. What we saw that is also like exacerbating the situation, of course, is the factor of, well, I don't know if you want to call it structural violence or social inequalities, but of course that in context of extreme vulnerabilities, right, like poverty, marginalizations, lack of access to basic resources, including protection, right? Those people are more at risk than, for example, participants of the HEP in Bogota or in urban centers, right? So that is like a complex situation where armed violence exacerbates social inequalities, or social inequalities also has a dialectic dynamic. And well, at the end of the day, we see that also social inequalities ended up reflecting in transitional justice, right? So not everyone has the same access or the same possibilities to access transitional justice because they are more exposure to violence. If they are under threat and they don't have any form, if they are living in a remote area, it's much more dangerous that to be or to have more resources in an area with more presence of the state, for example. So what we saw is three kinds of restrictions. One is this full cancellation of participation. People decide to withdraw from the process. Other is a partial participation, right? And that Juliet's going to explain later. So where people say, okay, I'm going to participate, I'm going to provide testimony, but I'm not going to say everything I know, right? So the construction of the truth is also challenged, let's say, right? And I mean, who could blame these people? They don't have not security measures, right? So to put their lives in risk, it depends also what kind of truth are we constructing under these conditions, right? And the third one is some kind of intermittent participation, right? So because violence is also changing and is dynamic in the territory. So perhaps in some months, the situation is not so tension, there are not so much, for example, in the context of elections, violence tends to increase in the territory, so perhaps it's more risky to go to the HEP, but perhaps in other contexts where people can get some security conditions, they can retake the process. So there's also like this dialectical, this changeable situation. And what we see is that, unfortunately, that leads to the fact that many voices and experiences and also the identification of perpetrators is affected, right? So just to show you two quotes, right, from the interviews. One is about partial participation, and it was in this interview with victims of the conflict, right, in Urabá, and where actually, and that's also very interesting, and the difference between online and face-to-face interviews, where we were feeling the fear, right, and it's very complex, and of course that people is afraid to say what is happening right now. Of course, why are they going to expose themselves, going to talk to the HEP, right? Name people, and perhaps to say information about crimes that when the perpetrators are still free and are there and are still controlling the area. And in the second, you can see also that was actually the HEP is aware of the situation, right? How it's so difficult even to appear before the HEP, because if you are in the conditions of confinement, for example, or where the region is dominated by armed groups, you can't even leave the area without saying where you are going. So if you are going to the HEP, of course that it has to be, everyone is going to want to know what you said there, right? Okay, now I give you, Juliette, for the second aspect of half-truth.
Yeah, thanks, Dario. Yeah, as you mentioned, because victims and appearing parties experience fear, or they really put at risk by revealing some information. Therefore, if they provide only part of the information, the possibilities to overcoming impunity regarding other perpetrators and other crimes, it's curtailed. In the case of state force agents of members, former or when they continue working by the state forces, the situation is that normally, I mean, it's like one of the judges of the HEP told us, is that as soon as they start to provide information of high rank commanders and their responsibility, they experience a lot of pressure, internal pressure. So it's very difficult for them to reveal information on these commanders or high rank responsible ones. And that's also very related to this discussion or tension to the role of the military, the army, and the state forces on the armed conflicts, because there are, of course, two complete narratives about what was their role, and that's why the truth is very dangerous, and many politicians and other powers are afraid of this truth. In the case of FARC members, maybe we can put the next slide, please. In the case of FARC combatants, I think the situation is even worse, because they have experiences I already show in another slide. I mean, many ex-combatants has been assassinated, and in this case, the pressure comes from dissident factions that are still active in their territory. And as soon as they start to reveal information, not only on the responsibility of these dissidents, but maybe other actors involved, like entrepreneurs or politicians, for example, they start to feel the pressure. And also because, as one interviewer explained to us, because somehow they are supporting and giving legitimacy to a peace process and an institution, the special jurisdiction for peace, that others want to combat, others want to delegitimize. So that also, that's the tension in this case. And of course, for many victims, it's very difficult to give information in some particular type of crimes, for example, sexual violence. There are many silences in this case. These silences also, I mean, these hard truths are very complicated also for the search of people deemed as disappeared. I mean, that's a very important endeavor of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, but some participants don't give information on this because they know that this territory, for example, the territory where this disappeared people is controlled by any group, illegal group, for example. So that's why these half-truths really curtail the possibilities of justice, of overcoming impunity. Can we go please to the next slide? Oh, also, sorry, you can maintain this slide before I continue. I just want to highlight that, of course, in many cases, and that was a very interesting interview with defense attorney. He told us that the contributions of perpetrators in terms of truth are tailored according to their perception of risk. Then there are, of course, negationism sometimes in matters that are very crucial for victims. And then this negationism or these partial contributions have, of course, an effect in the restorative possibilities. Because after all, as you may notice, truth is a very crucial aspect of this special jurisdiction for peace. I mean, they sacrifice or flexibilize the punitive aspect of justice in the pursuit of truth for victims, because it is supposed to satisfy victims' rights, and then therefore, if the contributions of perpetrators are restricted, curtailed, the perceptions of lack of commitment hinders the possibilities to build trust between victims and perpetrators. And also this ongoing violence hinders or hampers the possibilities to develop direct encounters in the very territories of communities, because they cannot guarantee the security. And that's also problematic at the moment to implement restorative actions, because the design of the peace agreement foresees that through these restorative actions that perpetrators can implement, it can foster somehow coexistence, reconciliation between victims and perpetrators. And actually, there are some very interesting research and publications on how communities perceive these restorative sanctions or restorative measures. And it is true that for victims, it's important to feel that perpetrators really perform or put in place actions to the benefit of communities. But of course, it is very difficult to implement these actions if there are no security guarantees for them and for the victims and communities. And also because there is this environment of lack of trust between victims and perpetrators, also as a consequence of this ongoing violence and the reconfiguration of violence. Yeah, can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, and then our preliminary concluding remarks, because it is, always we observe new important dynamics. Is first of all, we have here like a paradox and a very crucial dilemma. So the dilemma is basically we cannot wait actually until Colombia or any similar context have like a total safe environment to implement transitional justice. That's unrealistic to some extent. Although, for example, United Nations, the Special Rapporteur for the Promotion of Truth, Justice, Reparation, and Guarantees of Non-Recurrence, in many reports, they say security guarantees is a precondition to implement successfully transitional justice. But as already mentioned by Rosario, the majority of contexts are not of transitional justice, so peace accords or peace processes are not, I mean, this violence is not absent after the peace accord. And on the contrary, it's like very normal to have this violent piece of post-accord violence. So what to do in these cases? The wait is very, I mean, is undermining the possibilities of reconstruction and peace building. But of course, to implement the measures in these cases, as we already observed, and with the case of Urabá, brings many adverse effects on the participation of victims, perpetrators, and of course in the effectiveness of transitional justice mechanism. So we observe also, as a concluding remark, that the paradox includes the fact that even if transitional justice mechanisms are put in place to somehow fulfill the voids or failures of the ordinary state institutions, its role is complementary. It cannot replace regular state functions. Therefore, state has to be present to tackle these structural problems. And then trying to answer somehow what to do, how to find the balance between when and how to implement transitional justice. We think, and that's an important conclusion, that the design of transitional justice measures and mechanisms has to be more coherent or consistent with achievable transformative and transitional goals and gradual strategies. So more attention must be paid to correct timing and contextual factors and risk. And here I come back to the example of these restorative measures or sanctions that, if you observe in the peace agreement, they were supposed to be implemented in the very territories of victims, of communities, but the peace accord didn't have into account the problems or the restrictions, or the very high probability of a reconfiguration of violence, and how in this case it's very difficult to implement these measures in the very territories of communities and victims. And also linked to this conclusion, it's important to have context-driven assessment, continuously, for a realistic dialogue with victims, communities, and societies on the possibilities and limitation of transitional justice, basically because the peace, for example, in this Colombian case, the peace agreement actually created high expectations in terms of decreasing of physical violence, but also regarding the high goals as justice, truth, reparation, etc. But we observed to some extent that was not realistic, and these high expectations that are at the moment, in many cases, frustrated, lead to a further problem, because this frustration of the majority of victims and society leads to impossibilities to foster reconciliation, to foster, for example, further endeavors of peace, like this so-called total peace of President Petro. So yeah, that's our remarkable concluding remarks, very preliminary. And I want also to share with you that we have two publications on our based on our findings, our research project. I don't know if Rosario, if it is possible to share also the information about this that I sent you just a moment before.
We can do it later if you want to, and to share the link perhaps with the publications. One is in Spanish, another in English. But yeah.
So I can share it? Okay.
Yeah, I do it later. Yeah.
Give me just a moment. Okay.
Okay. Wait. Then. Yes. Yeah, now we give the place, I don't know, for questions or for debates. I know that we were a bit longer as expected, but well, it's difficult to tell all the details. That's in the airport when you arrive to Uraba. That's how what you can expect. So it's a banana region, as Juliet said, and I don't know, Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this two talks, actually, about a very intriguing research project you have done and conducted together with 6 people, I guess. Quite a challenge to do that, and everything written on transitional justice is so differentiated. In the meantime, there's so much having been published during the last 40 years, and so that this research picks up a very particular but very important point about the effectiveness of transitional justice means, and in particular when violence goes on, what happens. So who wants to start with questions? And I would like to encourage you to put your questions in English so that Juliet will be able to understand them too. Julia.
I have one comment.
Oh, comment is fine.
Yeah, I think I have more comment than a question because I've been there. So exactly 1 year ago, I've been to Uraba and I hitchhiked there. That was quite interesting because I hitchhiked with an Air Force pilot, Colombian Air Force pilot, and I was surprised of what the whole military guys do there on the street, because I drive there and there were, I think, dozens of, I think like 20, 30, 50 young, really young militaries. There was kind of war, what is that? If the cars were quite slow, everybody was fearing something. We passed for the small villages and was like, what is that? And I didn't understand it. And asked the guy, and he didn't tell me so much about it. And now hearing your presentation, I understand much more what I did there 1 year ago. So that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Who wants to put a question? Miriam.
Thank you very much for presenting the really interesting results of your project. And well, your question was, how does violence affect participation in transitional justice processes? But could also ask the other way around. How does participation affect violence? Can you observe that violence diminishes when participation is possible in those processes? I don't know if you asked that question or if you plan to ask it in another project, or if it's possible to find answers to such a question.
Should I? Well, actually, that was part of the risk, HEP-related risk, right? So we were asking people if the fact that they were participating in the HEP had increased the situation of risk and exposure to violence, right? And well, the problem in this context is like, because of all the conditions that Juliet mentioned, the absence of the state in those areas, like to provide security, the continuity of these groups is like, unfortunately, perhaps in the long term, of course, I think the participation could contribute, if there would be a fully participation, to reduce violence, because they would contribute to fight impunity, right? But as the situation is now, they don't have the guarantee to speak. So the fact of participating actually increase the risk, increase violence, right? Because the actors are still there. So perhaps it depends on the long term or in the short term. And also the fact if they, in the participation where it's partial, if they have like what we called also selective silences, right, in the testimonies. So of course that many perpetrators are not going to be denounced, are not going to be identified, and they are going to go on operating in those areas, right? So that's the problem. But as the situation is right now, it doesn't contribute, at least there, to reduce the violence. I don't know, Juliet, if you want to add something?
Yes, yeah, actually, I want to take this question in a more broad sense, because it is not only participation at the special jurisdiction for peace, but actually the participation as social leaders, for example, is at the level of, for example, the rural reform, at the level of other important reparation measures. So this participation is increasing the risk, of course, because there are evidently some actors or stakeholders in this conflict that they don't want to, they don't want victims or communities to participate, to fight or struggle for the satisfaction of their rights. And there is evidently some political sectors against this this peace process, and actually also against this strategy of the total peace. So I agree with Rosario. We cannot say participation can have the counter effect of diminishing violence. Is increasing the risk, the violence, but I just wanted to add this element of this broad sense of participation. Is not only the special jurisdiction for peace. No, that's what I want to clarify. Yeah.
Martin?
Thank you very much. First, my question is, how centralized or decentralized is the HEP? So can they enter into the territories or participate maybe with civil society or with self-organized communities and in the territory, or with the church, or with other groups, so that there is built some relational web, which might relations which might increase security. And an additional question: did you experience risk in your research?
I think Juliet can start.
Cannot hear you.
Okay, Juliet, perhaps you want to start with the.
I understood properly. The question is, how centralized is the HEP?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, good. So the special jurisdiction for peace, actually, the buildings, so to say, and the offices are located here in Bogota, in an urban center, where the perception of risk is much less than in other territories. But the HEP is actually trying to conduct many summons and hearings in the different territories, because they recognize the importance of know the context of communities. They understand the factual conditions and background, cultural background as well. And that's very connected to the fact that the participation approach of the HEP, as I already mentioned, this is collective, mostly collective. And why? Because many victims are organized as communities. For example, indigenous peoples, Afro-Colombian communitary consejos. I don't know how to translate this. Consejos comunitarios of Afro-Colombian consejos comunitarios. But also, for example, in one of the cases, a whole political party was considered a collective subject. So they are privileging this collective approach of participation. Firstly, because it's more practical. We have like hundreds of thousands of victims participating. Too many victims, actually. And secondly, because they want to take advantage of these organizative structures. And because somehow one of the aims of this participatory approach is to foster the strengthening of these organizative structures. So I would say, trying to respond to answer your question, that the HEP is more centralized than decentralized, but is trying, seriously to conduct hearings, summons, dialogic encounters in the very territories of communities. Of course, the problem in many cases, not only the Urabá case, but in Nariño case, Cauca case, is where to conduct the summons or hearings where the situation is so risky, so dangerous. No, for example, now it's another example. I'm working with case 05, and they are conducting an encounter in Santander de Quilichao, in El Cauca, but the Cauca region is so dangerous that they had to postpone so many times this summon, because they were not sure the security conditions were put in place. And because they have to guarantee, as already Rosario mentioned, not only that security conditions are put in place in Santander de Quilichao, for example, but also because many people have to travel from the residences to the place and then back. So they have to guarantee also these travels. So that's the problem right now. And to answer your second question about risk for the team or even for the people that we interview, I think, of course, we took the proper measures to avoid risk, and especially to avoid any increasing of the risk of the communities and victims we interview. But in the territories, the situation, Urabá, because it's the territory where we develop our empirical work, the situation is constantly like dangerous. I mean, that's why we had to carry on the interviews in specific places and really observe some measures to avoid any risk for the victims, because after all, we go and come back, but the victims live there in the territories. I don't know, Rosario, if you want to add.
Yeah, that was really a challenge, right? Because, and the question, I think, is more general, how to do research in these areas without putting anybody at danger, right? And I have to say that was interesting with this online interview modality. So we had to start online because of the pandemic. And then we went to the field, and of course, you lose and you gain something, right? Because my impression was, and I think, and now I think it is like that, in an interview, it's not the same face-to-face, especially if you're talking with people who experience violence, like to take to a stranger online, right? So it's not the context of trust, and it's very difficult. But I have to say that at the end, because of certain situations, we decided to go online, because of course, especially in local, very small places, people are all surveying. So when we were there, we also feel that everyone knew that we were there, you know? So it's like people go into the interview with you, even though they decide where the interview is going to be, it's a risk. And if you're at home, right, with your computer, nobody knows what you are doing at that point. Of course, you can have other security issues with technology, but at that point, there also, that's another issue, is very difficult to have connectivity. So, and yeah, you have to lose something. Perhaps you lose some kind of aspect of the interview of trust, but you gain security. What we did also is we offer people to choose if we were able to do it, right? Because so they know that the place better than we do. And I think that also was important to have the University of Antioquia there because they know the territory. And I think that's one of the most important things of these cooperations, right? Because if you go from abroad or from even from outside the area, not only from abroad, from Bogota, right? You need people from there knowing the connections, the relationships, what is dangerous, what not, what is risky. So I think that's very important to know the context very well. And we had the lucky to have the people from the University of Antioquia who actually had also a headquarters there in the area. So.
Then we have the next question from the student.
Thank you again. I would like to ask about your point of view in the current government, that taking into account the versatile, the peace approach. If you think that if you have seen some changes on the approach of the transitional justice, or if you haven't, because I think the current situation of violence is increasing in Colombia, and I don't know if maybe you see if there will be something that the actual government should or could do different in order for that to change, or if you think that maybe it's just something more contextual. Yes, I think I still have some hopes with the actual government, but I think the violence is currently increasing, so I don't know if there is something that is changing or not around it.
I am so sorry, but the quality of the sound was so poor that I couldn't understand. Rosario, could you please repeat? Because maybe because you are so far in the room, the quality was very bad. Sorry.
No, it was about the new government. How is the position to the transitional justice process and how, in the context of violence is actually increasing. And I think this can you better answer now regarding the total.
Okay, I'm gonna try to answer this question because at the end it's also a matter of political perception. So actually, this government, in contrast to the Duque government, the former government, is from the beginning on supporting the peace process, the peace agreement. That's clear, and they have like taken important steps to provide more funding to the implementation of the peace agreement, which was, I mean, in the former government, the funding was very, very bad. That's why the slow pace of implementation or very poor implementation. So they are trying, but the peace is very expensive. Peace is very expensive, and the implementation of this peace agreement, which is very ambitious, is very expensive. So that's an issue beyond the political will, that we don't have maybe enough funding to really implement properly the peace agreement. Secondly, as I mentioned before, there are political sectors, not only politicians, but some sectors in the economy, etc., that are openly opposing to this peace agreement, and at the same time to this strategy to the total peace. The strategy of the total peace, one can think, is like the solution to this factor that we identified of this partial peace, because they are trying to deal with all groups at the same time. ELN guerrilla group, AGC, but also criminal gangs, etc., with different legal instruments. And they are dealing right now with a very complex discussion on the political character of some groups and others that are just ordinary criminal gangs or something like that. The problem with this this strategy is, first of all, is very ambitious. Secondly, we don't have enough support from the society, because the perception is, for example, I'm gonna give just an example, is that we are giving too much, so much concessions to these criminals. We are giving them money and other benefits while they are criminals, and that's unjustified, and that's also not fair if you compare with the situation of other people, poor people, vulnerable people, and also because that's very expensive. This total piece is expensive in many terms. Then the other problem of the total peace strategy is that in Colombia, the conflict is linked to the illegal economies. That's very related to this greed hypothesis, which is that war to some extent is profitable, and these illegal economies are illegal mining, for example, but also illegal drugs or something like that. So for many of these members of these illegal groups, there is, to be in conflict and to continue the conflict, the confrontation, the disputes over territories is very profitable, and they of course earn much more money doing that than like going in this peace strategy. So that's another difficulty. And of course, there was the President Petro government started, last year, so to say. Actually, it was at the end of 2022. No, sorry, it was last year. I'm correct. But the problem with expectations is that because the structural character of this violence, I think, is very difficult just to change the conditions in such a short time, also having political opponents to this public policies, to other legal frameworks that could enable these peace endeavors. And also because although we are in the midst, so to say, of this peace total strategy, is still at the beginning, so we cannot say that we can have effects already, although I was actually searching these parameters last week. The impact of this post-accord violence was higher, for example, in 2020 than right now. We have different levels of violence, and right now is not the highest if you compare, for example, with 2020. As Rosario already mentioned, COVID was like a decisive factor for the increasing of violence, and right now illegal groups continue this violence because that's a sort of guarantee that they are in a better position to negotiate, so to say. I don't know, Rosario, if you want to compliment something. Okay.
Yes, we have one more question from Sergey.
Well, just to round it up, thank you very much for the debate and for the presentation, and thank you for offering us an insight in your approaches, because it's not only research, it's applied science, and it's a risky science, it's a cutting edge science, and you putting yourself at risk, obviously, and you're putting your informants at risk sometimes. The ethical bottom sides of your research are really striking. And I wish you really good luck at your peace-making process and peace-making research. Just tiny question, I'm still intrigued and puzzled why Antioquia. I am not a Colombia expert, but for me, Antioquia is a pretty hard bargain. It's a hard area. Antioquia always was a stronghold to paramilitary movements. The Autodefensas Unidas Colombia was always there. So you have a lot of migrants passing through, going to the Paso de Daría, and also so many difficult things going on that it's really hard to name a transition. It's a mess. So I would really like to know why you chose Antioquia and especially Urabá region.
Rosario, do you want
Yeah.
to?
Okay. Well, to say it short is because of what you say. Actually, if you wanted to know how transitional justice operates in context of violence, we couldn't do it in Bogota, right? Because even though it's not like it's totally safe, but we had to go to those contexts. And I think that because also there's this case, 04, where the HEP had this focus on Urabá, right? So we have like people participating, many people participating in the tribunal, and also because of our partnership. I mean, for particular reason, for the expertise of the Universidad of Antioquia. So it was like many reasons. Of course, it would be interesting to try what would be the results in Cauca or in other contexts. I can imagine that there are many common aspects also, but also some differences there could be, right? Because of the dynamics of violence. But well, I don't know if Juliet, you want to add something?
Maybe just to add something, it's that one of the first collective protection measures that the HEP provide was in case 04, Urabá. It was for the biodiversity zones of Curvaradoy and Higuamiandó. So it also it was very interesting to address this case because they had at the moment interesting advancements in terms of the functioning of protective measures in comparison with other cases.
Just to add to that, because the other part of the project also, it was this part of transitional justice, but we wanted also to see how effective protection measures were, and that's why also we had to go there where protection measures were implemented.
Yeah, at the moment there are no more questions, so I am allowed to put my own questions. The first one is about figures. You mentioned that 1,485 cases of murders are not resolved. We don't have any information about that. I was struck about this. That's much more than the ones you know something about. Why is it that way? Is there an answer for this? The second question is about, okay, I will just put some of the, I have many questions, is about, well, it's not really a question. I was also struck that it is so dangerous to tell the truth because in all particular cases, when you apply transitional justice means theory tells us that's the least you should do, to tell the truth to the people. Now we hear it's dangerous. No? So what does that mean? No? And there's another question about, yes, is there a transitional justice means for these murders after the treaty signing, for those murders?
For in the case of social,
after 2016.
Should I start with some of the questions and you with the others, or should we do that?
I'm gonna start and then I give you the floor.
Okay.
Maybe I start with the first question. That's very striking. That the huge majority of cases are with no information about perpetrators. So I just want to mention three things here. First, after 2016, there was like a sort of period of calm, like 2 years actually there was like a decrease in violence, especially kidnapping, for example. It was like the perception was like positive in terms of physical violence, the reduction of physical violence. But then during this time, I think the reconfiguration of other illegal armed actors was like consolidating, and then the problem when the violence against increased after this 1 or 2 years of pacification and decrease of violence, then the problem was that the people didn't know who were the violent actors. I mean, before at least they knew that's FARC-EP, that's EN, or that's paramilitary, as already mentioned, AUC. But then they were really confused. What are these groups? They didn't understand, for example, I mean, now it's more recognizable, but at the very beginning, they didn't understand that there are 3 different dissident groups. I mean, the FARC, as I already mentioned, had dissidents, people who from the beginning on said, no, I don't want to participate in this peace process, or people who signed the peace agreement and then they leave the peace process. And they are different factions, they are different groups, and the people didn't understand. Many experts at the very beginning didn't understand very well the nature and the character and the differences between these groups. Additionally, there are many criminal gangs, not unified, but very like fractionated. That's one reason why it's very difficult to identify perpetrators. Secondly, is like, especially during the government of President Iván Duque, the government and the state institutions and the defense minister, etc., they were almost negationist on the systematic character of this violence. They want to sell the idea that were isolated facts, because that was politically more convenient than accepting that it was systematic and that was political. This violence was to some extent also political. And I think that's the second reason. And the third reason is because the criminal research has focused too much on the direct perpetrators, but not in the intellectual authors. Why? Because that's our hypothesis. There are many economic actors and politicians and other actors behind these crimes. And that's connected to your question, I think, if I understood well, that many people, oppose this peace process because they see truth as dangerous. I mean, truth is dangerous not only for the ones who are willing to participate and provide, but truth is dangerous for many actors that benefit from this violence and this conflict. So they don't want to some information is revealed, because this information leads, for example, to the responsibility of the state, the responsibility of some economic actors, politicians, as in the case of the parapolitic phenomenon. I don't know, Rosario, please complement.
No, yes, I agree with you, and I think that Colombia is the country in the world with the highest rate of murders against social leaders and human rights defenders, including.
It looks like.
It is in the numbers, right? If you look at the reports of organizations, and I think there's a problem of the structural impunity, right? Linked to that, but I think that's something, and what you said, the third one, right? What happens with the people killed after 2016? Well, nothing, not only people killed, people displaced, people tortured, disappeared, right? And what I thought it was interesting also in the interviews, and is one of the problems with transitional justice sometimes, and what we said in the conclusions, so there's a state, so there's a justice system that everyone seems to have forgotten, right? Because there are so much expectations on the transitional justice tribunal, on the head, that they have to solve all the problem of impunity, but it's a temporary instrument. right? It's gonna be finished. And what happened? What states of that? What is the remain the connections with state institutions? And I think it's important to reinforce these connections, because if not, I mean, what is not just the justice system prosecuting all the civilians who are involved in crimes? It's not the head, or should be, it's not possible that the head is in charge of everything. They don't have the funding, they don't have the mandate, they don't have the power.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to add also, because you put a very crucial topic on the table, that actually the most structural measures of the final agreement are not actually the special jurisdiction for peace or the truth commission. For example, I personally think something very structural and very controversial for this reason is the rural reform, and that's why many actors are really opposed to the final peace agreement, because they don't want any rural reform in a country with the land is a matter of power, no? And in the same way, all these points or measures on the voluntary replacement of illegal crops, that's not convenient for many actors. That's why there is an open opposition to these people who is committed to the peace agreement in many different aspects, not only the special jurisdiction for peace. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much once again, and I think you deserve this applause. You might be listening. And I think the noise you heard is because we have a fitness room downstairs. There are some people working weights, brother. Miriam, maybe you announce the next session?
Sorry, it's in place as of the strike.
Maybe not in presence, but neither with Zoom. Ah, okay.
Yeah, it's
okay. So
yeah.
yes. Thank you so much for having been here. Yes.
Thank you very much for your attention and for having us. It's a pleasure, even virtually.